Friday afternoon in Sydney. In the supermarkets, shoppers stand beside full carts in lines that have stopped moving because every register died at the same moment. On live television, a newsreader is cut off in mid-sentence. The network can no longer keep her on the air. At the airport, travelers stare up at departure boards that have gone blue gate after gate, and nobody can tell them anything. The same blue is moving west with the daylight. Tokyo, Delhi, Berlin, London, New York, reaching not the internet's edges but the places people need most: the check-in desks, the hospital wards, the emergency lines. It is not a virus. It is not an attack. It is one small file, pushed out overnight by a security company most of the world had never heard of, received by millions of machines that trusted it completely. By morning in New York, it has a name: the largest information technology outage in history. And the man whose company sent that file, reading the first reports as they came in, knew the shape of this disaster by heart. 14 years earlier, at a different company, another update had gone out into the world, and the screens had turned this same shade of blue. He had been there too. To understand how one file could do this, you have to understand where that file was allowed to go. CrowdStrike was not some obscure vendor. It was the security company, the firm the world called in when its biggest breaches needed solving, the one that investigated the hack of the Democratic National Committee, the guard hired by more than half of the biggest companies in America. Its product, Falcon, does not sit politely on top of Windows the way an app does. It lives in the engine room, the deepest layer of the operating system, the kernel, where the code that runs can see everything and touch everything. That is the point. You cannot catch modern attackers from the lobby. You post the guard inside the vault. But the arrangement carries a quiet clause, everyone signed, and nobody read aloud. Anything that lives that deep can bring the whole building down with it. And because attackers change their tricks by the hour, the guard updates itself by the hour. Small files, called channel files, teaching Falcon what the newest threat looks like. Silent, automatic, trusted. Millions of machines, drinking from the same pipe, on a schedule no human watches. At 4 a.m, Universal Time, on the 19th of July, 2024, one of those lessons left CrowdStrike's servers. Channel file 291. A few dozen kilobytes, a fragment of configuration data, invisible even to the administrators of the machines that received it. Falcon read the file in the kernel, reached for a piece of information the file was supposed to contain, and found nothing there. A read past the end of its own memory. In the engine room, there are no small stumbles. Windows did the only safe thing it knows how to do when the deepest layer fails. It stopped. Blue screen. Reboot. And the restarting machine loaded Falcon again, which read the same file again, and fell again. A loop with no exit, repeating on machine after machine, in data center after data center, in time zone after time zone. 78 minutes after the push began, CrowdStrike pulled the file back. Too late for roughly 8.5 million machines, under 1% of the world's Windows computers, by Microsoft's count. But the 1% standing between ordinary people and a normal day. Airlines, hospitals, banks, broadcasters, ports, police. More than 5,000 flights died on the departure boards while their passengers stood underneath, watching. In Alaska, in Indiana, in New Hampshire, people dialed for help and heard nothing. In London, a news anchor stared into a camera that could not put her on the air. In Times Square, the morning crowds walked under billboards 40 feet tall and bright blue. Then came the cruelest part of the design. The machines could not be fixed the way they had been broken. The poison had arrived through an automatic pipe, but a computer stuck in a boot loop can never stay up long enough to receive the cure through that same pipe. The fix was medieval. A human being had to stand at each machine, boot it into safe mode, and delete the file by hand. Fleets of thousands of computers, one flash drive at a time, and many companies had locked their machines with encryption exactly as the security checklists demanded, and stored the recovery keys on servers that were themselves showing a blue screen. The guidance that went out that Friday from one of the most sophisticated software companies on Earth included the advice to simply reboot as many as 15 times and hope the fix slipped through a gap in the loop. Technicians gave up their weekends and worked like lamplighters, walking aisle after aisle of dark machines, bringing each one back for the person waiting on it. At the airlines, the queues wrapped around terminals. More than 1 million people stranded mid-journey by Delta alone. 7,000 flights gone over 5 days. Families sleeping under the gate signs. While the airline's chief executive put the bill at $500 million, a number CrowdStrike disputes to this day. On morning television that Friday, CrowdStrike's chief executive, George Kurtz, gray-faced after a sleepless night, said the company was deeply sorry. His written statement that morning carried a stranger burden, reassuring the world of the thing that made it all worse. This is not a security incident or cyber attack. The guard had not been overpowered. The guard had tripped and brought the building down himself. Here is what almost nobody in those airport queues knew. For George Kurtz, this was the second time. In April of 2010, the antivirus company McAfee shipped a routine update of its own. Virus definitions, the same kind of silent, trusted, machine teaching file. That update looked at one of the core processes of Windows itself and misread it as a virus. McAfee's software killed the process it was built to protect. Around the world, in hospitals, in police stations, in universities, people watched their Windows XP machines fall into the same blue loops, and the fix, then as later, was a human being standing at each machine. The chief technology officer of McAfee, the executive who spent that week apologizing to enterprise customers, was George Kurtz. Nobody suggests he wrote either update. Chief executives do not write virus definitions. But the industry had been handed its warning 14 years earlier, in perfect detail. A trusted security file pushed automatically to millions of machines, turning the guard into the wrecking ball. The warning was read, filed, and forgotten. The companies changed. The logos were repainted. The pipe stayed. The autopsy, when CrowdStrike published it, came down to counting. The new type of threat detection template was built with 21 fields of information. The code that read those templates supplied one fewer. 21 boxes on the form, 20 answers. Every earlier version of the file had left the 21st box effectively blank, so nothing ever reached for it. Through every test, every stress run, every successful deployment, the flaw sat there, latent, waiting for the first file that filled the box in. On July 19th, a file filled it in. The company's own validation software, the checkpoint built to catch exactly this kind of defect, had counted to 21 when it should have counted to 20, approved the file, and waved it through to the whole world at once. Not staged to a small ring of machines first, not held for daylight hours. Everyone, everywhere, in one push. In September, a CrowdStrike senior executive sat before a congressional subcommittee and apologized on the company's behalf. The fixes came in a steady public stream. The counting corrected, the validator rebuilt, staged rollouts for channel files, and customers finally given a dial to control how fast the guard learns. Every one of them was available before the disaster. None of them required an invention. They required only the belief that the file could be wrong. The reckoning is still being written. Delta took CrowdStrike to court in Georgia, fraud, gross negligence, computer trespass, and the case survived its first test and ground into discovery. Two sets of lawyers arguing over whether $500 million of chaos flowed from the file or from the airline's own aging systems. The market delivered its own strange verdict. CrowdStrike's stock lost a third of its value in weeks, and then climbed back and kept climbing because the customers largely stayed. Ripping out the guard, it turned out, felt more dangerous than forgiving him. The deepest change came from the landlord. Microsoft, whose operating system had absorbed the blame in 1 billion photographs of blue, began rebuilding Windows so that security software no longer has to live in the engine room at all, evicting the guards from the vault a full year after the vault came down. It was the quiet admission underneath the whole story. The architecture, dating back decades, had turned one company's overnight mistake into millions of people's ruined mourning. If it were one company's story, it would end there. It is not. In July of 2026, a single Amazon cloud region failed, and people stood locked outside their own front doors while their smart locks waited for a server. Travelers held at gates on logistics that had gone quiet. Hospital staff waited on messages that never arrived. The blue screens this time were invisible, spread across 1,000 services that all rented the same basement. That same month, a software defect inside Australia's largest telecom cut families off from the emergency line and left commuters standing on platforms where the trains had simply stopped. Different companies, different files, the same shape. We did not stop building single points of failure after July 19th. We consolidated faster, fewer clouds, fewer vendors, fewer files that more of the world depends on. The update that stopped the world took 78 minutes to recall. The agreement that led it, the quiet, unsigned bargain that the whole world may run on one file, updated in the night, trusted without question. That agreement has never been recalled. One file stopped the world because the world had agreed to run on one file. The agreement is still in force. 2 years after the blue screens, the machines still teach themselves in the middle of the night, silently, file by file, on their own. But the postmortem writes itself. The only question is whether anyone reads it before the next one.